Okay, class, we're going to make this a short and sweet presentation as much as possible. This is going to be your vocab for Unit 2 of the first 6 weeks. It's going to go over vocabulary from ancient Greece, Persia, and Rome. And so it's going to cover a pretty lengthy period, all the way back from the rise of the Persian Empire through ancient Greece and all the way through the Roman Empire to its collapse. And as far as Europe is concerned, this will end right before the Middle Ages starts. And then, as far as the East concerns, we'll actually be going in and seeing what has been going on in the East, aside from, say, the Persian Empire, as far as China, Indus River Valley, etc., into the second 6 weeks, before we get back over into the West and talk about the medieval period. All right, so let's get started. You will have a test on these, so make sure that you are paying attention. I've tried to put as much information on it as possible. First, we're going to talk about a polis. Polis was Greek for city or town, and it often represented is an interchangeable term with city-state from the 8th century on. A city-state itself was the city or polis itself as well as the surrounding area. So think of it as kind of a metropolitan area, except such as like, say, the Houston area with, say, Pasadena and the suburbs outside of it, smaller towns. But there's going to be a whole lot more farmland, obviously. It's not going to be as urbanized as we are today. It is it's also a principal form of Greek community. This is not just a physical thing that you can touch, it's a concept. When somebody talks about representing their polis, it's in the same way that somebody talks about representing their country. And so there's a very almost nationalistic type representation of the polis, and we're going to talk about that later on. As you can see, this was a picture of a polis. This is more or less representing kind of Athens with the Acropolis on top here. Okay. And then the city or polis itself, and then these surrounding little town areas. Okay. That's obviously, they're not always going to be like right within view of the actual main polis. These could be miles away that it would take all day to get to. Okay. You can see we also have port areas. An oligarchy. This comes from the Greek term meaning rule by a few men. Obviously, this is typically going to be wealthy man, and so very often oligarchy is going to be somewhat interchangeable with an aristocracy. This replaced a system of rule by ranked chieftains as the standard form of governments during the early city-states. Later, in certain areas, they'll be overturned, and then sometimes they make a comeback. Some places they stay as a government system throughout the ancient Greek period. So we see some constantly interchanged periods between oligarchic and democratic governments in many Greek city-states, especially Athens. Even though they're most famous for being democratic, they also have periods of time where they go back and forth between oligarchic or either tyrannical type governments. And these are often spurred by revolutions, which often added up to tension between the rich and the poor. And so we see this back and forth of them. And each time they try to improve it a little bit more. And so it's not just, it doesn't just stay the same throughout the entire period of time. Ethics. Ethics is a branch of philosophy that involves systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong conduct. It's different than morality, whereas, morality is just, hey, oftentimes it talks about why you shouldn't do things as far as what's good or evil, but oftentimes it doesn't necessarily always explain why it's evil. Ethics seeks to resolve these questions of human morality. It seeks to answer the questions where morals oftentimes don't. For example, certain religions will say that it's immoral to say have an alcoholic beverage. Okay, ethics will actually try to resolve that question. Why does it say that? If a lot of times these morals aren't necessarily explained very well, and so ethics tries to explain that. And typically for that, ethics would say, well, it's not necessarily evil to do that, but you have to do it within moderation so that there are health issues at stake, and then you could be a danger to others if you are, say, under the influence of an alcoholic beverage, and so you definitely need to have some control of that. But in and of itself, it may not necessarily be evil, and so ethics oftentimes will often shed light on a middle ground. Like many words in the English language, it derives from an ancient Greek word, ethos, coming from habit or custom. Acropolis. This literally means the upper city. It was typically the location of a citadel of a city or town where temples or religious temples or even government temples or architectural structures were placed, and that these were very, very extremely special places. They were also areas where Greek citizens could escape in times that, in case that their city became besieged, because it was a high area. And here's the Acropolis of Athens. So you can see if the city itself was besieged, the citizens could find a little bit more protection by going up to the Acropolis. Democracy. Democracy is a form of government that we first see start to arise in classical Greek that permitted all free male citizens some degree of participation in politics. Eventually, it did evolve to the point where it didn't matter how wealthy you are or what your family background is. At the very, very beginning, you had to have so much wealth or land, or you had to be considered almost kind of like a Greek noble type background. Eventually, this goes away, and each time Athens' democracy evolves a little bit more. Despite these ideologies of equality, there were economic inequality still prevailed in the same way that they prevail in our own republic or democracy here in America. We still have these types of issues. Nevertheless, it was a very, very big step forward, and Athens encouraged democratic governments in all of its allies. Some of them went along with it, some of them did not. But it was not equal for everybody. For example, women, slaves, and foreigners could not vote. The term is based off of the Greek term demos, which means a territory and the people who live in it. Typically in a democracy, at least from today's standpoint, you have some variations. A direct democracy is literally where everyone is allowed to vote, and their vote directly has an input into what the government does. But there are other forms of democracy, and we'll talk about those later on. City-state, this is interchangeable with the polis, okay? But you need to know another term, okay? It is a self-governing political community composed of a principal city and its surrounding countryside. So this is really interchangeable with polis, at least after a certain period of time. So like we were talking about in direct democracy, this is where voters have a direct say in government decisions, and it typically requires more micromanagement, meaning almost every single decision that a government needs to do. Hey, do we go to war now? You have to call every single citizen to vote on it. Okay, as the populations tend to get larger, this becomes largely impractical because a lot of people live far away from where the government headquarters are, and for them to have to drop everything that they're doing, their work, their family life, and go all the way in to make a vote, it's pretty impractical. And so a lot of as we kind of go along, what we'll see is a lot of governments and societies will actually make it more representative in the sense of democracy, a republic, to where instead of me having to go up to Washington, D.C. every single time that the government wants to make a decision and vote on it, I elect somebody to represent me and vote the way I would want them to vote. Okay, then there's some argument there that maybe that we elect them to make educated decisions on things that we don't know about. And so then there you have the thing of, okay, does a representative or should a representative vote the way I want them to vote, or should they vote their own conscience, and I should be educated enough to know this is what they're going to do and support them in that decision and trust that they have more education in that particular decision than I do. So that's a continuous debate with republics, which is a little bit of a variation of democracy. Philosophy. We see the rise of philosophy in ancient Greece, the study of general and fundamental problems concerning matters such as existence, knowledge, values, reason, mind, and language. The Socratic method. This was a method that was come up with by the famous Greek philosopher Socrates, and it essentially, and you can read it here, but essentially it's asking questions and answering people's answers with more questions in order for them to get used to thinking about their answers and thinking about their own thinking, if that makes sense. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about it more in class if we haven't already. Zoroastrianism. This was a monotheistic religion introduced during 570 BC in Persia. It teaches that there were two deities, a good god and a bad god. And it held that the whole universe was a battleground between the good god and the bad god. And those who led good lives and supported the good God would go to a place like heaven and be rewarded, and those who led bad lives would be punished in a fiery realm. Despite Christianity coming from Judaism, this Christianity actually adopted this concept of having good people go to heaven and bad people going to a place such as hell. The earlier Jewish peoples, if you led a good life, you could go live with God, but bad people tended to not go to hell. They just kind of disappeared into darkness, and their punishment essentially was just indifferent distance from God. So they didn't really have a punishment necessarily. It wasn't a bad place, but it wasn't a great place either, where you went after you died, or you didn't go anywhere, depending on what sect of Judaism you kind of adhered to. Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism definitely influenced Christianity as far as that goes, and there is still a small population of followers to this day in areas such as Iran, but they are a extreme minority, and they aren't very vocal because that particular area isn't necessarily very tolerant now since the rise of Islam. Hellenistic, this is based off of Hellenes, the Greek name for themselves. It derives from Helen, an eponymous ancestor that they kind of came up with that kind of gives them kind of a common background. This is kind of a myth. I mean, we don't really have any archaeological or historical evidence that this is even based in truth. It's typically used to refer to the period following Alexander the Great's consolidation of his empire, and it's meant to show all of the Greek influence and how it had spread throughout his empire and dominated the known world. And it can also refer to the cultural fusion between Greek, Middle Eastern, and Indian cultures that formed during Alexander's empire, and then the empires or kingdoms that ruled after his reign, that were ruled by his generals after his death. Republic. So I mentioned republic a little bit earlier. It is a type of representative democracy where voters elect representatives to promote their best interests. And this is so those people don't have to drop everything they're doing and fly up to Washington, D.C. just to vote on every single little thing. They get a representative to do that for them. And we'll talk about Rome's role as a republic for a time. Consul. This was the highest elected office of the appointed office of the Roman Republic and the subsequent Roman Empire, and it was later used in other societies following the fall of Rome as well. Urbanization. This is the rise in people moving from rural to urban areas and the effects it causes, including the increase in size of urban areas. If you've taken world geography, you should be somewhat familiar with this concept. The 12 Tables. This is the legislation that stood at the foundation of Roman law. We'll talk a lot about it more in depth, its origins, and how it still has a legacy today. Christianity is Should be a very familiar religion, so I'm not going to go too much into it right now. I have some highlights of what you should probably know about it, and we'll talk about how it influenced the changing world throughout the Roman Empire and into the medieval area and all the way to the present day. So very, very important religion. Definitely has a huge effect on the entire world, and especially the Western world. Inflation. Inflation is a sustained increase in the general price level of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. When price level rises, each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services. So, for example, you used to be able to buy, say, a pack of gum for a nickel. Now it costs you over $1. Okay, the gum itself or the actual money itself is not worth as much. It cannot buy you as much. And the way that usually happens is that if I have $1 and I say it's worth so many, depending on how I've determined that value, I say it's worth so much. If I print more money, then there's more money. It's kind of a supply and demand type thing. The more of something there is, the less it's worth. Okay, the less of something there is, and if there's a high demand for it, the more it's worth. And so this happens as governments continue to print money, and inflation seems to be inevitable in most economies, and usually governments and societies have to kind of adjust to it, meaning how much am I going to get paid for the job that I do? How much are you taxing me, etc. The Hagia Sophia. This is a famous large church that it was built during the Byzantine Empire. It was built a couple of times. The current structure itself was built under Emperor Justinian, who was a very, very famous Byzantine emperor, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's a very, very important architectural work in the late antiquity and then early medieval period. If you want to go and qualify it as that, you can. It's still around today. It's located in modern day Istanbul in Turkey. And here it is. Justinian Code. Almost all European law, except for Anglo-Saxons, is based off of this. It was a codified Roman law. There were multiple laws that were from the Western Empire and Rome, and we'll talk about that. And so there are multiple parts of this Justinian Code. But ultimately, Justinian kind of helped codify it and consolidate it into a few collections here. And almost all European law is still based off of this today. And we got it back from the Byzantines during the Middle Ages, etc. Except for England. They're a little bit different. And we'll talk about Justinian as well. Province. Province is an administrative division within a country or state, kind of like the United States, as Texas could be considered a province of the United States. Most countries, such as Canada, etc., that have these types of divisions use the term province. The United States is different in that we use the term states, but we could very easily have been the United Provinces, and it would have meant the same thing. You have provinces in the Roman Empire itself in order to divide up the rule and make it a little bit easier for administration, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. As you can see, we have little provinces: Hispania, Gallia, Italia, Dalmatia. These are different ones. Germania, which was never completely conquered, Britannia. Okay, each one of these was under a provincial governor who reported to the emperor or the senate, whether during the Republic or the imperial period. Pax Romana. This is a supposed long period of peace brought on by Augustus Caesar to Europe and the Mediterranean world. By our standards, it's not really peaceful. There were actually a lot of conflicts and wars going on during this time, but it is kind of the peak period, or this kind of golden age of the Roman Empire, and it's right at the very beginning of the Roman Empire, coming out of the ashes of the Roman Republic. And so when we think of Rome, we tend to think of the Pax Romana. This is the golden age of Rome, and ironically, obviously not peaceful. This is one of their greatest periods of Roman expansion when they were expanding out. This is also during the time, you see this during the time of Christ and during the time of Augustus Caesar, the successor to Julius Caesar. And so it's a really, really important time for Rome. And it's what Rome is, the time period of Rome that it's most remembered for, arguably. So just to highlight, it's not completely peaceful there, so we see some battles here. Evangelism. Evangelism is preaching of the gospel or practice of giving information about a particular doctrine or set of beliefs with the intention of converting others to the Christian faith. And it's still around to this day. In fact, one might even argue that evangelism could also be a modern phenomenon that we've seen grow since the late 1970s as well, at least in America. But we can also refer to it to the spread of Christianity, which occurred during the late Roman period. Judeo-Christian law. This is simply the doctrine of Judeo-Christian religion. It is mainly the New Testament directives from Jesus and his followers, with a little bit of arbitrary combination from the Old Testament as well, such as the Ten Commandments. The Edict of Milan. This was issued by Emperor Constantine I and his co-emperor Licinius in February 313 Common Era. It was an edict of toleration that essentially gave Christianity legal status within the Roman Empire. This encouraged fair treatment of Christians in the Roman Empire, which until this point had been persecuted. And so this was a really, really big deal. It built upon the Edict of Toleration issued by an earlier emperor, Emperor Galerius, who Constantine succeeded. This specifically prohibited the persecution of Christians and permitted them to practice their religion so long as they didn't offend the public. The Edict of Milan was a further act of toleration that was even more so and almost encouraged Christianity and gave it legal status as the Roman Empire. This would be followed up by Christianity essentially becoming the dominant religion and the official religion of the Roman Empire itself. This is the Chi Rho symbol, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It's coming from a Greek meaning and had very, very special meaning to Constantine himself in his devotion to ending the persecution and increasing toleration for Christianity within the empire. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail within a later video or presentation. And that is all of your academic language that you need to be looking at for the second half of the first 6 weeks.